And what I found out most schools were calling teams were really what I ended up naming as franchises. So I go to this fifth grade team meeting and I find out it's not a team meeting, it's a franchise meeting. Each teacher owns a fifth grade class. They meet once a week. They exchange tips and strategies, but then they go back and they run their own fifth grade. Just the way franchise holders exchange tips and strategies, but when they go back, they're all running their own stores. And the profit margins from one store don't influence another store. When you step from franchise to team, it's because you're now taking shared accountability, shared responsibility for the learning outcomes.
Welcome to The Teaming Edge, a show about education leaders and the actions they take to support team and school performance. In today's show, Steve Barkley, author and education consultant, will share his insights on the power of a professional learning community. According to DeFore and others in the book, Learning by Doing, a handbook for professional learning communities at work. A PLC is an ongoing process in which educators work collaboratively in reoccurring cycles of collective inquiry and action research to achieve better results for the students they serve. So PLCs focus on learning, collaboration with collective responsibility, and they tend to have a results orientation. So let's listen to Steve as he describes the context and the experience that led him not only to becoming a leading education consultant, but also an expert on professional learning communities.
I had the opportunity to student teach in an experimental program. And so I spent a year student teaching. So my entire senior year at university, I was in a grade 4 classroom with a master teacher, 2 student teachers, a graduate intern, and visiting professors. So it was constant feedback in that, every lesson you taught was observed by someone. And when it was over, you left the room with a cup of coffee and sat down and chatted about what happened. And you spent the rest of the day watching other people teach and having similar conversations. I graduated and took a job in an open concept school that was a brand new school district being formed. Prior to that time, students traveled to a neighboring community to school, and now the community was opening its own K-8 school. I was on the 5th and 6th grade team. So it was 100 students in one large area with 4 teachers and 2 paraprofessionals. Kids went home early every Wednesday afternoon, and we had a common planning block for teachers. And as that team of teachers, we were responsible for all the 5th and 6th grade kids. And everything was done as a team. After 5 years of that, on a dare, I transferred to teach 1st grade. I team taught with Diane. Diane and I had a double classroom, anywhere from 35 to 50 kids, depending on the year, a paraprofessional and a student from the university program. But Diane and I were also part of a K-1-2 team. And there again, once a week, that team of 7 teachers met and was responsible for planning the K-1-2. So all of my teaching was done with somebody else in the room and engaged in some group of people making learning decisions. So it wasn't until I began working as a teacher trainer in PD and began to travel to other schools that I recognized how different that experience was from what most people were having.
Yes, that is definitely a very different experience from what I had and from what I think most of my colleagues have had. And something that you said that was particularly salient for me was you said we were responsible for all 4th and 5th grade students. We and all, that is very unusual because I usually hear me and mine.
That was the change. Yeah, a 5th grade student who was struggling belonged to the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade teachers. It wasn't my student. Mm-hmm. The ultimate of that occurred years down the road of working like that. When I was team teaching 1st grade, we actually reached the point where we convinced the principal to do a joint evaluation on us. So when he came to do an observation for evaluation, it had both of our names on the top, and it didn't separate what Steve did or what Diane did.
Wow.
The teachers was the language that he used.
That's remarkable.
Yeah. And we presented it to him because we said, it's really kind of silly. We're having to plan a lesson that's different from the way we teach so that you can come and do an observation.
Right. Well, it does make sense when you think it through. Well, Steve, I've heard you say that teaching is a team sport and a transparent act. Tell me more about that.
Well, I described that there probably was a time that you can tell, again, from my experience, I've always felt that kids were better served by a team of teachers than individuals. But I think there may have been a time back where you could be an outstanding biology teacher. You could sneak in the back door, teach your 4 block periods of biology. And as long as kids got good biology scores, everything was okay. I don't think that exists anymore. And I think teaching, as most other professions, has become extremely complex. So today, if you're a biology teacher, you're also going to be held accountable for students' writing skills. And if you're a language teacher, you're going to be responsible for kids' ability to read and interpret that biology textbook. And so there's no way that can happen without teachers working as a team. I think the whole push on social emotional learning is another reinforcer of it. You can't make that happen as an isolated teacher. It has to be a student's day-long experience and interactions among the school. So if teachers are going to work on a team, that's the first part of my statement then. If teachers are going to work on a team, they have to have trust for their colleagues. And I can't figure out how you can create trust without seeing people work. So if you go back to my beginning days, you saw everybody's teaching all the time. So you had trust and respect in your colleagues. If people are working in isolation, if we look at the research today that talks about collective teacher efficacy, I don't know how you build collective teacher efficacy if you don't see the work that your colleagues are doing. So that's what brought those two things together, that teaching is a team sport and the people around you have to be able to see it.
Well, what I also hear as you are describing that is, in order for someone to develop trust, and you said they need to see people work, in other words, they need to see their colleagues in a vulnerable state. So it's almost as if vulnerability comes before trust.
Bingo. You can't have vulnerability without trust.
Yeah.
If you want to build trust, somebody needs to be vulnerable. My definition of being a teacher leaders are the people who are willing to make themselves vulnerable before trust has been built. So if you're a school leader and you want to create trust in your building, you're looking for those teacher leaders who will step forward, make themselves vulnerable. And then as other people observe that vulnerability and the safety of being vulnerable, then other people begin to join in.
So that's powerful for our listeners, our team leaders that are listening to hear, is that one way of defining leadership, I'm sure there's many ways of defining leadership. One would be you go first.
Absolutely. Move that into the principalship. The principal and the instructional coaches in a building ought to be the most coached people in the building. They're making themselves highly vulnerable so other people pick up that model, and that's what begins to build the trust. If you think about it back in the classroom, a teacher who's looking to build vulnerability with students in order to have trust probably is beginning by making him or herself vulnerable to the students.
So that's assuming, and I'm making an inference, that you are describing a coaching culture as opposed to something we do when a teacher is not complying or not.
Absolutely.
They're perceived as not being whole or complete or doing it wrong or whatever.
Absolutely. So the first book that I wrote on coaching was called Quality Teaching and a Culture of Coaching. And my title was chosen because I wanted to communicate that coaching wasn't an isolated activity. It's a tool that describes the way you go about doing business.
So let's move into PLCs. That has been a popular term for quite a while, professional learning communities. Why PLCs? What is the power in a professional learning community?
Well, let's take it back to what I've already described for an initial starter, and that is teaching is a team sport. So there's your team, and you need to make yourself vulnerable. So that's where you make yourself vulnerable. Now, the other word that I want to pull in there is learning. So it's a professional learning community. And I've described the difference between a professional learning community and a professional working community. So a PWC, a professional working community, is a group of people who come together and they cooperate in order to get work done. And that's not a bad thing to do. It's a good thing to do. But I separate it from a professional learning community, which is a group of people who come together because we don't know what to do. So when we lay down student assessment results or we look at student work, if we knew how to get a different outcome from the students, we'd have already gotten it. So the fact that we're looking at this work and saying we want to achieve something different from our student than what we're achieving, we now have to learn how to do that. And that's the purpose then of joining a professional learning community. That's where our learning is going to take place. So frequently when I'm talking to administrators, I suggest that a question they frequently ask teachers is to describe something that's been a recent learning of yours from your professional learning community. And if people can't talk about that, then you've probably got professional working communities rather than professional learning communities.
Yeah, you can't just throw a label on it and then say that that is, in fact,
historically what happened, which is why there isn't a real good definition of professional learning communities out there.
So we have the espoused theory and then the actual theory in action, and so those aren't always aligned. Well, I think it's interesting. You've mentioned describing what teachers are doing. So, of course, lawyers have a practice, doctors have a practice. I don't think we think of teachers as having a practice, but teachers indeed should be practitioners, and a PLC is a place for doing that.
And that's where I call the word professional in, that if you look at teaching as a profession separated from a trade. So I described that if you're in a trade, you learn and are taught and are coached the right way to do something, and then your responsibility is to do it the right way. When you step into those areas of profession, you now need to study a lot and learn a lot, and then you conduct experiments with your clients. So attorneys experiment with their case, and doctors experiment with patients, and teachers experiment with learners. So as you're experimenting with your learners, you're gathering the data, you're collecting the information, and you're coming back to your professional learning community to extend your learning, to solve a problem that you haven't been able to solve on your own.
So clearly, in order to do that, a leader would need to put into place structures and processes that cultivate and foster that level of professionalism with aspects of psychological safety so that it's encouraged in a productive way. I mean, what are your thoughts about how to create a collegial environment for that to occur?
Well, the starter is that you are, as a leader, you're setting it up as a problem-solving group, and that the group is engaged in identifying the goals that are going to drive their work. It's very interesting. Just today, I was on a phone call with a principal of an international school in New Delhi, looking at introducing professional learning communities to a school that doesn't have the culture, hasn't historically had it. And we were discussing a starting point, and the conversation was around what is the goal of student learning that a group of teachers in your school would be passionate to want to cause to happen. And the teacher's desire for that result of student outcome, that student learning, whether that be academic in writing skills or math scores, or whether it be in social, emotional, or time management skills, learning how to learn, whatever it is the teachers decide to pick. The key issue is that if you start with something that people are passionate about wanting to make happen, that's the beginning driving force now of bringing that group together. Then you have to teach the skills, because a lot of teachers historically haven't had experiences in working in that kind of shared accountability community. And you need a chance to teach and coach people in developing those skills.
Yeah, a powerful question, a powerful purpose is a great place to start. So, when you mentioned problem solving, it made me think of a process that I have an affinity to, the design thinking process, where if I'm starting a project or trying to solve an adaptive challenge, I'll go through this design thinking process, which includes identifying a problem, empathizing with stakeholders. That helps give me context to find out what the problem really is, which is usually not what I thought it was. Then ideate, prototype, implement, and repeat. You have a wonderful theory of action that is similar to that empathizing stage in design thinking, which includes all stakeholders that support student learning in a school, as well as the actions that those stakeholders take to ensure students are learning. This is such a powerful tool. Could you please give us a little introduction into this?
Well, the starter point for me of a team forming, first of all, is finding that goal. So I've actually begun playing with the statement of goals before norms. Everybody's big on setting norms for how the group's going to work together. I'm suggesting your norms get a lot clearer and you got a willingness to work with the norms once you've got that goal. And for me, in a school, the goal has to be student outcome. Recently, in a conversation, somebody told me their school goal is increasing inclusion. And I suggested back to them, no, that's not a goal, that's a strategy. There's an outcome you want from increasing inclusion. So in my head, I jumped to two immediately. It's the learning of the perhaps special needs or diversity student that's being included, but it's also the learning of the rest of the students. There's something that you're looking for your whole community to gain. So that has to be set as part of your goal. So I described the process of, okay, here's the goal we want to reach. My next backward step then is what student behaviors would cause that goal to be met. And I label that as student production behaviors. I'm big on the statement, teachers don't cause student achievement, students cause student achievement. So I got to be able to identify what is it that the students would do that would cause the learning to happen? And now I'm ready to go back the next step and say, okay, what are we as teachers going to do? So what are the teacher behaviors that would generate those behaviors from students? And now how do we work together as this collaborative team to implement that whole process? Which is why I'm very often bringing peer coaching into PLCs. So as an example, when I was talking to that principal today about how to get started with PLCs in her middle school, we discussed the possibility of looking at their English language learners as a core group in seventh grade. So now I've got all the seventh grade teachers focused on that group of kids. We identify that we need those students to take on a certain risk-taking behavior in the classroom in order to generate their learning. So they're speaking up, they're making attempts. And then we decide, okay, so what do we have to do to create that environment? And so now we start going into our classrooms, observing each other as teachers. What are we doing to create that environment? Then we start observing the kids. Can we record that increased risk-taking and participation on the student's part is happening? If that doesn't happen, we're never going to get to the language outcome that we eventually want to measure. And so that's why I'm always pushing everything through that backwards planning process. The goal on the front end, which is the result in students, and then working backwards from that.
It is really such a great tool because it brings us out of theory into concrete actions. And I know from experience, I would easily say 80 to 90% of teachers I ask who has the greatest influence on student outcomes, everyone answers teachers. And when you redirect and help them see that actually the students are the ones that are doing the things that are getting the outcomes that we're trying to measure, they're like, oh yeah, right, that makes sense. So I appreciate the beauty and yet simplicity of this. So what we are referring to here is Steve's theory of action template. And what I'll do is I'll add a PDF of the template so you can have access to this powerful tool as you plan with your PLCs. Just to reiterate, the student outcomes need to be identified. Then we identify the student actions that are going to get those outcomes. Those identified student actions are going to inform teachers on the actions they're going to take to influence the student actions that you're looking for. The PLC is going to help build a teacher's toolbox, their skill, their understanding, their knowledge, so that they're going to be more effective in the classroom. And then leader actions are going to help inform how they're supporting a team. It seems to me when going through this process, as let's say we identify student actions, and then we start identifying teacher actions to inform that, the process of going through teacher actions then sparks another student action that they hadn't considered before. So it's almost like it goes back and forth.
Absolutely.
As it's spiraling, or as they're gaining more and more clarity on what
Absolutely.
are the actual actions we're taking.
Yeah. So, I've been working with a new word a lot, John, and that is hypothesis. Mm-hmm. So when you set that goal that you want students to achieve, you now form hypothesis. So you form hypothesis as to what student production behaviors will get the students there. You form a hypothesis as to what teacher behaviors will get those student behaviors. And now you start checking out your hypothesis. And the reason this is a profession is that hypothesis that you had, well, we just discovered it works terrific with 85% of the kids. We need a new hypothesis for the other 15%. It's that constant back and forth. So this teacher behavior on my part gets the desired student behavior from this group of students. There's another group of students that teacher behavior doesn't generate the student behavior. And so it's back to the drawing board. That's why I want to have that PLC. I don't want to be hung out on my own on this. I want to be able to go back to this group and keep working on finding the hypothesis that moves us closer and closer to the goals that we've set.
So it's an iterative process.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So adults are on, as far as I can tell, a lifelong trajectory, and they go through many stages of adult development. Teams, too, will go through stages of team collaboration. So can you describe how you see this continuum of team collaboration? I've heard you describe the idea of individual, franchise, and team. I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
So if I'm a school leader and I describe individuals are when people complain about having to go to a team meeting, and their complaint is usually, this is my time, I should be doing my work. So what that's telling me is that the framework that person is working from is that they're seeing teaching as this individualized task. And then people begin to make a first step that I call we share. I was in a school and I met with the staff and I said, tell me about your teams here. And they said, oh, we have really, really strong teams. And I say, well, give me an example of why your team is so strong. And the teacher said, well, we share everything. So I ended up writing a blog on the difference between sharing and teaming. Sharing is nice. It's a nice step there in that direction, but it's really not a commitment that you get with a team. And what I found out most schools were calling teams were really what I ended up naming as franchises. So I go to this fifth grade team meeting and I find out it's not a team meeting, it's a franchise meeting. And what I mean by that is each teacher owns a fifth grade class. They meet once a week, they exchange tips and strategies, but then they go back and they run their own fifth grade. Just the way franchise holders at some fast food restaurant might go to a franchise meeting, they exchange tips and strategies, but when they go back, they're all running their own stores, and the profit margins from one store don't influence another store. For me, when you step into from franchise to team, it's because you're now taking shared accountability, shared responsibility for the learning outcomes. So as an administrator, I can look where various groups in my school are on that continuum, and then think about what behaviors it would take on my leadership part to begin to give them the experiences to help them move across that continuum. And then if you think of schools being changing places, you have people who are going to leave, and now you've got two new members on a team. It's not unlikely that that team's going to back up some on the continuum. And now I have to look at how I can work with building it back up.
How can leaders ensure that they are coaching teams where they are on this continuum?
So number one, your leaders in your school ought to be in a PLC. And as a PLC, they should be setting goals for their teams just the way the teachers' PLCs are setting goals for their student learners. And now they're beginning to identify what leadership behaviors can I take on. And I'll give you an example. Jim Knight and I had this conversation in a podcast that we recorded about PLCs, that in many cases years ago, instructional coaches were sent into PLCs to teach teachers how to function as a PLC. And in many schools, they never came back out. So if you have a group of individuals trying to begin to function, they probably need an outside person who's going to work as a facilitator and begin to give them the initial experiences that they need to develop the skills to move across that continuum. But I got to keep in mind that until that person can get out of there, they aren't really functioning as a PLC.
So here Steve was referring to that podcast. The title of that is A Conversation with Jim Knight. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Jim Knight. He's a senior research associate at the University of Kansas Center for Research on Learning. He's also the founder and senior partner of the Instructional Coaching Group. So he's written several books on instructional coaching. And in this conversation, they talked about that idea of coaches coming in and building the capacity of the PLC rather than taking over and disempowering the teachers that are part of that PLC. So we want the coaches to come in, provide guidance, build capacity, and get out, where their time is really needed in supporting individual teachers throughout the building. Steve also mentioned a little bit earlier that leaders should be in their own PLC. So this made me think of a question that I asked: what would the theory of action look like for a PLC of leaders? Would they start with student outcomes? What would that look like?
Well, in this case, for me, they would start with defining what does a high-functioning PLC look like and sound like. So now let's create a 1 to 7 scale. So at 7 is this high-functioning PLC. What does it look like and sound like? And down at 1 is a group of teachers who are angrily going to a meeting that's written into their schedule. That's now a 1 on my continuum. So now let's describe what a 5 and a 3 look like, and we now know those spots in between. Now let's take a look at the PLCs that are in our school, and let's do our assessment. Where would they fall on this continuum? Now let's set our goals. For me, a great goal is to take that group that's a 2 and move them to a 4. And do you have a group that's at a 6 and you want to get them to a 7? Now, this is really important because your leadership behaviors with those two groups are going to be totally different. Just the way a teacher's behavior needs to be differentiated with students in the classroom, depending on the goals the teacher's working on with that individual or that small group of students.
A leadership PLC, so let's say a group of administrators, their outcomes would be trying to objectively define where their PLCs in the buildings are and then creating an outcome about moving the PLCs.
I worked with a high school. I think there were 6 members of that administrative team, and they each had 3 or 4 PLCs. And when they met, they had to put the work of their PLCs out on the table, just the way teachers would go to a PLC meeting and put your student work out on the table.
Okay.
So here's the agenda from their last 3 meetings. Here's the things that are happening. Here's the things that they're doing. Now, what behaviors am I going to take on as a leader to assist that team in moving across to the next step? Just the way a teacher would be looking at what are the behaviors I'm going to take on to begin to get those student behaviors that are going to cause that student learning.
Yeah, so PLCs, I imagine a common practice would be looking at student work, and the administrator PLC is looking at adult work.
Absolutely.
And you use the example of the artifact of the agenda. That's brilliant.
See, I believe that systems need to be holding leadership accountable for the effectiveness of PLCs. So if a system is investing time, the cost of time in teachers being in PLCs, then the leader should be accountable for what's happening during that time. So for me, minutes and agendas of PLCs are critical. And I should be getting questions and feedback from my administrator as he or she is looking at the minutes from our PLC meeting.
Let's take that a little further. So education, of course, is very challenging. Teaching and learning is complex. Of course, you have a knack for bringing clarity to a team, but I know there's a lot of constraint. Schools and teams complain of financial constraints, physical space constraints, time constraints, of course. How do effective PLCs stay focused, efficient, and productive and still engage in the learning that's required for a PLC? You spoke about the agendas. How are effective teams actually managing their time wisely?
I got to take it back to that goal. So remember, it's a goal that's driving the PLC time. So it's not uncommon for me to work with a group of teachers in a PLC where there's other things on the agenda that need to get accomplished when they meet. So I'm actually working with some groups that, we've got a 45 minutes that the sixth grade team is meeting. And for that 45 minutes, the first 20 minutes is our PWC time. That's our professional working community. So here's the things on that agenda that need to get done. And then the last 20 minutes, we're a PLC. So you would expect that the agenda for that first 20 minutes, that's a PWC, that agenda is going to be constantly changing with all the things that are happening around the school. But the PLC agenda has got to stay focused long enough on the same issue for us to work it through the whole process. So what's important is when you aren't doing PLC work, you need to know you aren't doing PLC work. That's a starter. I have administrators that here's 10 things to do at your PLC meeting next week. So the top of the note should say your PLC meeting's been canceled because these emergency things need to be done. Don't let people think that while they're doing those emergency things you just put on their agenda, it's part of their PLC.
That is really powerful. So educators should give themselves permission to do the PWC work and the PLC work, but let's be very clear and name it.
Yeah. I'll tell you, one of the groups I love the most, they actually had a room where all the PLC meetings were held, and they had one wall whiteboard facing the one end of the table that was PWC, and the whiteboard facing the other way was the PLC. And the person facilitating the meeting would actually end the meeting and they'd move to the other side of the room and everybody would swivel their chairs. And it was a physical movement to redirect your mind because you need to now have PLC behaviors. And they're different than the PWC behaviors we just had. I've written some on that. I describe it as the difference between cooperation and collaboration. So in your PWC, you want to be cooperating, finding ways to work together and get these things done. When you slide over and you go to that PLC, now you're going to be collaborating, likely to be much more disagreement during the PLC time than there was back in the PWC time because we're learning. We're trying to figure things out. We're trying to form a common hypothesis. And we don't want to form a common hypothesis too quickly. We want to make sure we've done enough of our homework. We've observed enough students. We've been in each other's classrooms enough. We got a reason to believe that we're going to now invest in that hypothesis.
Now, you mentioned earlier goals before norms. So I guess it would stand to reason PWC norm and a PLC norm may be very different.
I have people actually take the agenda, and you can do this two ways. Take the agenda and say, what on our agenda goes in the PWC? What on our agenda is a PLC? And I've had people do it the other way. Look at the agenda. Where should we be cooperating? Where do we need to be collaborating? Begin to get people to become conscious of those things.
I love what Steve is saying here. It is okay for teams to cooperate in a PWC to get things done and collaborate in a PLC in order to test their hypotheses. But it is important that teams are aware and intentional about which of those will best support their goals. Teams want to be both efficient but also scientific as they identify the most effective influences on student achievement. A proponent of this idea of identifying influences on student achievement is John Hattie. Hattie, a professor of education and director of the Melbourne Educational Research Institute at the University of Melbourne, Australia, who has done the largest synthesis of meta-analyses of the effect of different factors on educational outcomes. He's often quoted as saying, "A year's worth of growth for a year's worth of effort." Here I ask Steve how a PLC can measure their impact to ensure they are providing a year's worth of growth for a year's worth of effort.
Well, I'm real big on Dufour's three big ideas.
As mentioned at the top of the podcast, Dufour's three big ideas are 1. Focus on learning, 2. Build a collaborative culture, and 3. Focus on results.
And for me, results are student achievement. They're student goals. And that's the only way for the PLC to measure their success. We aren't a great PLC because we had an awesome science fair or we had this really terrific family reading night. Those might all be things we did and things we carried out. But the real thing we're testing out here is that investment that we made having a payoff for our students.
So what is going to prevent teachers from just implementing quote-unquote best practices? I can open this book, I can see a list of strategies, let's implement those. How do teachers put all that into context of the student outcomes?
So my interesting answer to that is that we all have kids who defy best practice.
Ah, that's true.
So if you're looking for a hypothesis, trust me, the first place I'd go is best practice. I mean, that makes total sense. But as soon as you implement best practice and it's not getting the results you want, then that's why I'm in the PLC. You know, the frustrating teacher voice for me is the teacher who says, just tell me what to do. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm sorry, we don't have any openings for that right now. You know, it's not. You know, we can't write this curriculum guide that's going to tell you what to do. It's going to support you. It should make your planning and your thinking and your design work easier. That's what it is to be a profession. That's why you're forming hypothesis. So when you're implementing best practice and it's not getting the result from the student, what do you begin to look at for change and modification? Why do you bring two of your colleagues from your PLC in to observe the student?
With stand to reason, if you've got the theory of action, you've created a lot of clarity on what the outcomes are and what the actions are. And then we're measuring the PLC's impact by measuring student achievement. How do you connect that? So we see the achievement scores and then we reflect back on all the actions. What does that look like?
Well, we shouldn't have to be waiting for the achievement scores. I mean, that should be a final measure for us. If I were a principal and I had teachers in their PLC set goals for students. So if I give you my example, I'm big on teachers kind of grouping students. So if you're a high school teacher and you're working with 150 students in biology, which of your students would you identify as being advanced? And which of your students would you identify as being highly proficient? And then which kids would you say are proficient? And you've got some kids below proficient. And then I frequently talk about a category you might call intensive. So those are students that might have an IEP or they're learning English as part of trying to learn biology. Now, so you're looking at about 5 major groups of kids. Now, set goals for each of those groups. So at the beginning of the year and you got some advanced students, what's your goal for your advanced students by the end of the year? I'm hoping it's not meeting the standards of your course, because that's probably the goal for your proficient students. Okay. And I got into doing that because when I found that group of kids who were highly proficient, I found those were the kids that were most frequently being overlooked. The kids who are advanced might be being sent out of the classroom for special activity, but I got that group of kids who are highly proficient. and they're frequently doing the same activities that the proficient kids are doing. So you're not going to get a year's worth of growth out of that group of students because you need to set a higher goal. Now, I've got students who are below proficient. Are there some of those students that you're looking to be proficient by the end of the year? Or for some of those students, based on where they are, I got a student who's 2 years below reading level. I may not have them reading on grade level by the end of the year, but what is the goal that I've set? Once PLCs have those kinds of goals and they're functioning with them, then as an administrator, come November, December, I ought to be able to check in with my PLCs. And my question is, which kids are on target and which kids are off target for meeting your goals? And what's being planned for those kids who are off target?
So the straightforward approach that most educators seem to take is we want to get all of our students to hear.
I would say that runs against most schools' missions and vision statements.
Tell me more about that.
Well, let's talk about equity and diversity. Equity isn't getting all the kids to the same spot.
Right. So that approach with the way that you identify the outcomes, putting them into groups, you really are addressing equity, ensuring that every student has the resources, the opportunities to get that year's worth of growth that they're promised.
Yeah. And I'm going to say for some students, a year's worth of growth is going to be an insufficient goal to set.
In other words, are you referring to trying to close the achievement gap?
Yeah. Coming out of this now, I'm real big to talking to people. Let's make sure you're accelerating and not remediating. If you think the COVID crisis has put kids behind and you've got a sixth grader who's working on a third grade or assesses at a third grade level, let's not be remediating that student by trying to teach them the third and fourth grade skills. I got to be teaching that student the sixth grade skills and building all the support necessary for them to be learning the subset of skills while they're working on the higher order skills. I can't have them working on third and fourth grade skills as a way of trying to get them caught up to sixth grade. We have a pretty long history in this country. Once you send a kid to a remedial class, the gap between that student and the rest of the kids increases.
Steve is not wrong about this. The achievement gap, which refers to the disparities among racial and ethnic minorities, English language learners, students with disabilities, and students from low-income families. Remediation of these various groups puts them on a track that finds them farther and farther away from their peers that are not being remediated. Remediated students are more likely to take remediation classes in college, resulting in higher costs, which creates additional disparities. The pandemic is devastating for many families in the above-mentioned groups. So to Steve's point, effective PLCs don't remediate students that are falling behind, but rather accelerate these students so that they get more than a year's growth for a year's effort. Steve works with teams all over the world, so I asked him what PLCs look like in light of the pandemic.
Well, to give you the interesting spot is I've had many instructional coaches tell me that PLCs that were high functioning before COVID hit used that high functioning piece to help assist the teachers. It was a solution focused group to solve a new problem. The interesting thing is some coaches found that it caused PLCs that weren't very effective to increase their effectiveness because the teachers were thrown problems that they didn't know how to deal with them. And so the survival mechanism actually got them to collaborate on a new level. I like Margaret Wheatley's work in that area, and I talk about acting crisis-like in non-crisis times.
Steve refers here to Margaret Wheatley, who is a speaker, teacher, consultant, advisor, and author of 9 books. She's also the co-founder and president of the Berkana Institute. And Steve is referring specifically to a book that she wrote with Myron Kellner Rogers titled A Simpler Way, which analyzes the key elements of teaming that emerge under crisis conditions.
What did we learn about the need and the ability to work together effectively in order to deal with the crisis that was in front of us? Let's not lose those behaviors as we get vaccinated and open the school doors back up.
So during that crisis that Steve's referring to, Margaret Wheatley would say there are 3 areas of focus here, and that's flow of information throughout the team, rich and diverse relationships among the team, and a common vision that unites the team. With these 3 things together, a team is able to work through during a crisis. So to Steve's point, we don't want to lose sight of these 3 important factors after the crisis has passed. Now I'm going to ask Steve one final question. What's the one thing you want to leave our listeners, who themselves are team leaders, with that can help support creating effective PLCs?
I guess if I was to roll it into one, it would be what I call model the model. So if you're a school leader and you went into a classroom and you were observing student learning, what would you see that would just thrill you, knowing that you were in a classroom where students were functioning at a very high level of autonomy and developing a quality set of lifelong learning skills? Take that picture and now use that picture to look at the same thing as you walk into a PLC meeting. A PLC meeting should be a quality learning experience, similar to in modeling what you want teachers to go back to their classrooms and create. Historically, I used to share with administrators, how would you feel if teachers left your faculty meeting and went back and used that as a mirror for what's going on in their classroom? So the question all of us working in professional growth and development of teachers need to be asking, professional learning. How comfortable are we if teachers take the experiences they're having as learners with us as leaders and use that as their model? And then in your bigger districts, you got to be pumping that up to central office.
Right.
When principals are coming to a function for principals, to what extent is that modeling all the way back to what you'd hope to be seeing in a teacher's classroom? Because if it's not, it's likely the principals are going to be going back to their schools and modeling what the central office leadership offered to them. So my phrase for leadership going way back was model the model.
I love that. Steve, you have a tremendous amount of expertise, a wonderful perspective that started years ago when you were put into that unique situation and was in that transparent team environment. So we've just scratched the surface. How can listeners find you so they can get more information?
Easy spot, barkleypd.com. So if you go there, I've got a spot on my homepage called Hot Topics. And if you click on Hot Topics, PLCs is one of the hot topics. And it'll separate for you at that spot blogs and podcasts and video that I've created on the topic of PLCs. And that's an easy spot to leave a question for me. And I always value questions from educators because that drives my learning.
Wonderful. Steve, really appreciate your time.
John, thank you. Thank you. I've always appreciated working with you, and this was one more that I can put on that list of great times to interact with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
You got it. Thank you. That concludes my interview with Steve Barkley. Now I'd like to leave you with a free tool to support you as you are leading professional learning teams. So if you go to my website, johnwilliscoaching.com/tools, you'll find a collective efficacy assessment that will provide an analysis and specific actions you can take to support your team where they are. This is a free assessment based on 3 domains: culture, conditions, and competencies, so that you can ensure you're fostering collective efficacy among the teams you support. Go to johnwilliscoaching.com/tools to get your free collective efficacy assessment now. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember, your leadership actions make a difference. What are you committed to this week? I'm John Willis, and you've been listening to The Teaming Edge.